I had always believed my life was predictable. Mornings began the same way, the sharp ring of my alarm dragging me from sleep, the bitter taste of black coffee burning down my throat as I skimmed through unread emails, and the race to catch the subway, where I stood pressed between strangers, swaying to the rhythm of steel against tracks. 8 hours at the advertising agency followed. Relentless cycle of meetings, deadlines, and last-minute client demands. A few stolen moments of laughter during lunch. A rushed commute home. Then came the numbing routine of collapsing onto my couch, scrolling aimlessly through streaming services, half watching the same show I had promised myself I would finish but never did. It wasn't a bad life, but it wasn't much of one either. It was structured, safe, devoid of anything that could shake the balance I had carefully built. No surprises, no unruly emotions, no disruptions. Until Emily. She arrived 6 months ago, transferring from the Chicago office, and from the moment she walked into the agency, everything shifted. There are people who demand attention the second they enter a room. Loud, commanding, impossible to ignore. Emily wasn't like that.
She didn't need to be.
Her presence filled the space without effort, as if she belonged everywhere, as if the world rearranged itself slightly just to accommodate her. She had sharp, defined features, high cheekbones, a strong jawline, the kind of beauty that was striking in its simplicity. But it was her eyes that caught me first. Dark brown, intelligent, always searching, as if she was cataloging every detail, every nuance, every unspoken thing in the air around her. Her laugh was the kind that stayed with you, low and rough, the kind of sound that made people turn their heads just to hear more. She joked easily, spoke with a quiet confidence that made people lean in when she talked. And people did. They gravitated toward her. By the end of her first week, she had seamlessly integrated into the office's social fabric, slipping into the rhythm of our workplace like she had been there all along. Everyone liked Emily. It was impossible not to. And for the first few months, I convinced myself she was just another colleague. Another name in my inbox. Another presence in the background of my carefully structured life. But I was wrong. It wasn't a grand moment that changed everything. It wasn't some dramatic realization, some earth-shattering epiphany. It was just a Thursday, just another ordinary day. I was at my desk, half listening to a coworker drone on about a client's last-minute revisions, when Emily walked past. She paused beside me, leaning just slightly against the edge of my desk, and without preamble, she tilted her head toward my laptop screen. "You have good taste," she murmured, nodding toward the Spotify playlist I had open. I blinked, caught off guard by the casual way she said it.
Oh.
"Yeah, I guess." Her mouth quirked slightly, like she was amused. "You guess?" I shrugged, suddenly hyper-aware of how close she was, how I could smell the faint traces of her perfume, something warm and musky, something that lingered in a way I knew I would think about later. "It's just a mix of things I like," I offered, suddenly wishing I had put on something more interesting, something I could defend with confidence. Emily didn't move away. Instead, she studied me for half a second longer, as if she could read something between the spaces of my words. And then, finally, she said, "I like it." And the way she said it, soft, certain, like it meant something more than just a comment about music, sent something unfamiliar twisting low in my stomach. Something that felt dangerous. Something I wasn't ready to name. The problem was that after that moment, I started noticing too much. It was subtle at first, nothing I couldn't dismiss as coincidence. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more impossible it became. I started catching myself watching her too often, too closely. The way she bit the cap of her pen when she was deep in thought, brows furrowed, eyes scanning the screen in front of her. The way she absently tapped her fingers against her desk while waiting for an email to load. The way she laughed, really laughed, tilting her head back slightly, her eyes crinkling at the corners, a sound so warm and unfiltered it settled into my skin long after it faded. And then there were the touches. They were small, barely their things. A hand brushing against my forearm as she passed, a nudge of her knee against mine in a crowded meeting room. But each one felt deliberate, intentional, even if I couldn't prove it. Emily was like that effortlessly physical in a way that made it hard to tell if it meant something, or if it was just her. But then there were the words, the compliments that felt heavier than they should, like they were carrying something unspoken between them. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into a look, a touch, a tone of voice. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. And then came the night of the company party. The office had rented out a rooftop bar in Midtown, a sleek place with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Inside, the music pulsed through the crowd, mingling with laughter and the clinking of glasses. People were looser than usual, the formality of work slipping away with every sip of wine and whiskey. I had started the night cautiously, keeping to small talk and safe conversations, but somewhere along the way, I had relaxed. Maybe it was the alcohol, the warmth in my chest from the wine I had been nursing for the last hour. Or maybe it was just her. Because Emily was everywhere, laughing with our coworkers, dancing without a care in the world, moving through the party like she belonged in it in a way I never quite did. At some point, the noise became too much, and I stepped outside to the balcony. The crisp New York air a welcome contrast to the heat inside. The city stretched out before me, lights flickering in the distance, taxis weaving through the streets below like golden veins. I took a slow breath, exhaling into the cold, letting it clear my head. And then I heard her. Escaping already? I turned to see Emily stepping onto the balcony, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the city behind her. She wasn't shivering, despite the cold, her black blazer open over a dark top, the fabric clinging to the sharp angles of her frame. In her hand, she held a short glass, ice clinking softly as she swirled the amber liquid inside. I needed air, I admitted, my voice steadier than I expected. She hummed, stepping closer. Figured. You don't really do the whole office party scene, do you? I smirked, looking away. Not exactly. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us stretching comfortably. The noise of the party faded behind the glass doors, leaving only the distant hum of the city below. And then, so casually it almost didn't register, Emily spoke again. Do you have someone's? The words caught me off guard. I turned back to her, blinking.
What?
She tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes unreadable. You know, a someone. She took a slow sip of her drink, watching me over the rim of the glass. The question settled uneasily in my chest, twisting something inside me that I didn't quite understand. It wasn't strange for coworkers to ask about relationships. It was normal, casual small talk. But this wasn't casual. The way she asked, the way she watched me, waiting, there was something else there, something I didn't know how to name. I hesitated for half a second too long before answering. No, my voice came out quieter than I meant it to. And you? Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she just smiled, a small, knowing thing before looking away. Not really, she said finally, swirling the ice in her glass. Not really. I should have let it go. Should have changed the subject, laughed it off, stepped away before whatever this was had the chance to solidify into something I couldn't ignore. But I didn't. And neither did she. She watched me, studying my face like she was searching for something I wasn't ready to admit. Her fingers tapped idly against her glass, her body still, but her presence wasn't. It filled the space between us, made the air feel heavier, thicker. And then she spoke again. Is there something you want to ask me? My breath caught. I felt my pulse hammering against my ribs, my body locking in place as every possible question swarmed to the surface of my mind. But none of them made it past my lips. Because the real question wasn't one I had the courage to ask. And Emily knew that. She took a slow step forward, just enough for our arms to brush, just enough for my breath to hitch, for my fingers to curl into fists at my sides, resisting the urge to lean in, to close the distance that suddenly felt like a chasm. And in that moment, every excuse, every justification I had built up over the past few months shattered. Because it wasn't in my head. It never had been. And the real problem, the one I had been so desperate to avoid, was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I wanted Emily. So much more than I ever should. In the days that followed, the tension became unbearable. It wove itself into the fabric of every interaction, turning even the smallest, most mundane moments into something charged, something unspoken but undeniably there. It was in the way Emily's gaze lingered just a second too long when we passed each other in the hallway. The way our hands brushed when reaching for the same file, neither of us moving away as quickly as we should have. The way I became hyper-aware of her every movement, of the sound of her laughter drifting from across the office, of the way she absent-mindedly tapped her pen against her desk, of the way her presence alone changed the air in a room. I tried to act normal. I tried to convince myself that nothing had shifted. But everything had. And I knew she felt it too. We didn't talk about it, not directly, not yet. But the silence between us was louder than words. It wasn't avoidance, it was a waiting game. A careful dance, towing the line between caution and inevitability. And then one night, the waiting ended. The office was nearly empty, the overhead lights casting a dim glow over the quiet space. The hum of computers, the faint clatter of a keyboard somewhere in the distance, the usual sounds of an office long past business hours. Emily and I had been working late, finishing a campaign presentation that was due the next morning. The hours stretched on, the world outside growing darker, and the air inside growing thicker with something we weren't naming. It had been like this all night, glances exchanged over the glow of our screens, moments of silence that felt more significant than they should have. Too much unsaid, too much felt. And then, without warning, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the room, sudden and complete, save for the faint blue glow of my laptop screen. The hum of electronics died, replaced by an eerie stillness. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet stretching between us like an unspoken challenge. Then, Emily laughed. A low, hushed sound that sent a ripple through me, making the darkness feel different, less empty, more intimate. "Well, that's ironic," she murmured, her voice cutting through the silence. "Looks like the universe wants us to stay in the dark together." I swallowed hard, forcing a breath past the weight in my chest. My eyes struggled to adjust, but I didn't need to see her to feel her presence. I knew she was close, too close. Her voice carried that familiar edge of amusement, but beneath it, there was something else. Something that made my fingers tighten around the table's edge, made my pulse stutter. "This isn't funny," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Emily's voice was softer now, and I heard the subtle shift of movement, closer. "Feels kind of fitting. Fitting. Because this, us, whatever this was, had been existing in the dark for months. Hiding in stolen glances and lingering touches, in things left unsaid, in all the ways we had pretended not to notice. The only difference now was that there was nothing left to distract us. I turned slightly, and that's when I saw them, her eyes. Even in the low light, I could see them, deep brown and steady, locked onto me with something unreadable. Or maybe I didn't know what it was, and I just wasn't ready to name it.
My throat was dry.
My pulse a mess. And before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "What are we doing?" A pause. The kind that lasts a second but feels like forever. And then, instead of answering, Emily reached out. Her fingers brushed against my cheek, light, testing, deliberate, as if she was waiting for me to stop her. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because the moment her skin touched mine, something inside me snapped, or maybe something inside me fell into place. I didn't think. I reacted. My hand lifted, fingers wrapping around hers, holding tight, as if letting go wasn't an option anymore. As if some invisible tether had been pulling us to this moment for months, and now that we were here, there was no going back. There were no more doubts. No more waiting. No more pretending this wasn't real. For weeks, I had convinced myself that I had only two choices: run or give in. The push and pull had been relentless, a battle between the part of me that ached for something I wasn't ready to admit and the part that still clung to the illusion of control. I had spent countless nights staring at my ceiling, replaying every interaction, every fleeting touch, every unspoken moment between us, dissecting them for meaning, for escape routes. I had tried to reason with myself, to reduce it all to coincidence, to tell myself it was just an infatuation, something fleeting, something that would pass. But it hadn't. It had only grown, stretching into every inch of my life, until she was everywhere, in my thoughts, in my breath, in the spaces where she wasn't even present, but somehow still felt. And yet, I still told myself I had a choice. That at any moment, I could take a step back, retreat into the safety of my carefully constructed life. I had been so wrong. Because that night, when Emily kissed me, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt inevitable. It started slowly, carefully, like a moment suspended between hesitation and certainty. Her lips brushed against mine in a way that wasn't rushed or demanding, but deliberate, as if she was waiting for me to realize there was nothing left to fight against. It was warm and steady, and when she leaned in just a fraction more, deepening the kiss, something inside me gave way. My breath caught, my hands reaching for her without thought, fingers curling into the fabric of her blazer like I needed something to anchor me. And maybe I did. Because the second I kissed her back, the world tilted, or maybe it was just me, falling into something I had spent too long pretending wasn't there. The months of tension, of quiet longing, of everything we had ignored came rushing in all at once, folding into the way she kissed me, into the way her hands cradled my face, thumbs brushing against my skin like she had memorized me long before this moment. I could feel her heartbeat against my ribs, her breath mixing with mine, the quiet urgency in the way she held me there, as if afraid I might change my mind. But I wouldn't.
Not now.
Not when every cell in my body was screaming that this was exactly where I was supposed to be. When we finally pulled apart, I barely remembered how to breathe. My forehead rested against hers, my eyes still closed, as if keeping them shut would somehow make this moment last longer. My pulse was erratic, my skin burning with the memory of her touch, her lips, the sheer gravity of what had just happened. Emily let out a slow breath, a soft, almost triumphant sound. And then, she smiled, against my lips, against the silence, against every thought still spinning in my head. "You're still overthinking," she whispered, her voice tinged with something amused, knowing. I let out a breathless laugh because she was right. I always thought too much. Analyzed, second-guessed, built walls where there didn't need to be any. But for the first time, I didn't want to. So I let go of the thoughts, the fears, the questions, and I let myself feel.